Hi, I'm Linda Mao, and welcome to Art This Week. In this week's episode, we visit the Dallas Museum of Art and speak with curator Heather MacDonald about their exhibition, Bouquets, French Still Life Painting from Chardin to Matisse. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, I'm Logan Smith, and I'm here at the DMA with curator Dr. Heather MacDonald to discuss the exhibition Bouquets, French Still Life Painting from Chardin to Matisse. Thank you for being with us today, Heather.
Thank you.
I first want to start out by asking how the exhibition got started and how the idea for Bouquets actually originated.
Well, I cannot take credit for the initial idea. It was actually my co-curator, Dr. Mitchell Merling, who's the Paul Mellon Curator of European Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, who came to me with the idea. And at first we were just talking about possible loans from the Dallas Museum of Art collection, whether there were things that might work in his show. And the more that I talked to him about it and looked at our collection, I thought, wow, we have such a rich body of work in this area. And I went back and I was like, could we collaborate on this? And luckily he was very open to that idea. So we then kind of talked about, when you sort of brought in the work from the DMA, how did the exhibition sort of change? And we sort of shaped it from that point together. And that was about 3.5 years ago that we started working together on it.
What is the significance of the French still life painting, and why were the painters of this time painting floral bouquets?
Right, well, yeah, so that's the other thing I probably should say is that this was not an obscure genre. It wasn't, this was a genre that was practiced by almost all painters at some moment, I would say. There's, even painters that we associate the most with sort of narrative painting, with history painting, with literary painting, someone like Delacroix, also, had that moment of delving into this genre. So it's something that touched many artists' careers. As to why, I think it is one of the most traditional genres. Independent still life really only emerged in the 17th century, end of the 16th century into the 17th century, but there was always floral still life within paintings. Had always sort of been there as a little element, whether it was a little bouquet in the corner of a biblical subject or something like that. So that it was a old genre that could be sort of renewed, refreshed, made modern in all kinds of surprising ways. It was a very accessible genre, and I think the other thing that you sort of see as this constant thread is that it's a very direct confrontation between sort of the painter and the subject, that there's nothing intervening in a way. There's not outside reference, there's not metaphor, there's not narrative, there's not even another figure sitting there like in a portrait. It's just the painter with the subject, and it's very much about that act of painting and sort of being immersed in the act of painting. And that becomes more and more sort of present over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century. As you said, the exhibition, the subtitle is French Still Life Painting from Chardin to Matisse, and we were really, really pleased that this painting was able to be included in the exhibition. It's the only surviving flower painting by Chardin. He made others, but this is the only one that survives. And it was such a talisman for later painters. Chardin was enormously respected in his own time and written about both by critics and other artists, but also in the 19th century when he was really rediscovered in the 1850s and 60s in exhibitions, in the sort of major gifts to the Louvre of his paintings, so that for artists of the 19th century he became this sort of new master that they discovered again in the 1860s. So he was important sort of both for the first part of our narrative, the origins of this genre in France, but then also for a later moment when we're looking at painters even into the 1870s and 80s still thinking so much about Chardin and what his mode of painting the still life was and how different it was from any of his contemporaries.
Can you please describe to us the importance of the Franco-Dutch artists such as Gerard van Spandonck moving to France and their influence on the French still life painters?
Sure. Gerard van Spandonck was maybe the first of this school of artists, a generation of artists who were born in the Netherlands or in Belgium and came to Paris and made their careers in France. He came from a very modest family of painters, decorative painters, and arrived in Paris, was sort of trained as a miniature painter, became the miniature painter to the king, and then sort of found ways that he was trained as a botanical artist. And so he's very much a sort of self-made artist in many, many ways that then rose to the sort of the height of his profession in the academy and in the sort of royal hierarchy, because he was not only the miniaturist to the king, he then became the sort of it was called the first professor of flower painting in France, but it really meant that he was the leading botanical artist in France. So he had a very important official role and really forged this school of artists that brought a northern manner of flower painting. Sort of, if you think about Rachel Ruysch or Jan van Huysum, some of these, later Dutch painters that painted these very, very grand, elegant bouquets, but there's something lighter, I think, in Van Spandonck and in many of these Franco-Dutch painters. There's something more decorative, their palette is fresher and lighter, and he often incorporates these little touches of contemporary French taste. For instance, this pedestal on which the bouquet, the basket of flowers is sitting, has a version of a bas-relief that Van Spandonck has adapted from a marble by the neoclassical sculptor Clodion. So this is a modern, quite trendy neoclassical motif of someone making an offering to Eros, this woman making these burnt offerings to Eros. So he's kind of folding in these little trendy contemporary French notes into a traditional still life painting. So he was very successful at marrying that northern tradition with a sort of new modern interpretation in France.
I love these little birds.
Are they they're so fantastic, yeah. I mean, I sort of interpret this sort of element as being a reference to this classical story or myth from Pliny about almost the origins of still life painting, where she writes about the artist Zeuxis, who made a painting of grapes that was so lifelike that birds came and tried to peck at its surface. And this being sort of this, incredible, illusionism of still life painting. So I have to say, I think that probably Van Spandonck he's sort of saying, hey, look what I can do. This is how this is how realistic and how convincing I am, and how, in a way, how knowledgeable I am about the whole tradition of still life painting, that he's putting himself into that lineage that goes back to classical Greek painting.
Fantin-Latour was kind of the epitome of the French floral painter. Can you please describe his influence on the other painters and how he got to the prestige that he had?
Yeah, it's interesting that now I think we think of Fantin-Latour first and foremost as a painter of flowers. I don't know that he would have seemed that way to his contemporaries, certainly not in France. A lot of his floral subjects he made for collectors in England. And the things that he was showing in France and that his peers were probably seeing in his, in exhibitions were a lot of times figure subjects. He was also a great portraitist, and he, made many portraits. He painted mythological subjects. But those are not as beloved, I would say, today. And so, it's interesting. There's a little bit of a reversal of how we think of Fantin-Latour, and that his flower paintings now seem so central to his identity. And they were, if you just look at the sheer number that he painted. But the way he managed his career, he really kept those two sides of his practice separate. And he often kind of chafed at, I feel like he had to keep making these flower paintings for the market, that there was just this insatiable demand for them and didn't allow him to do other things. But then he also did keep returning to it and wrote about how much he loved making flower paintings. And the interesting thing is that even though he said, that I have to paint them because the collectors want them, he also often thought that they were paintings that only his fellow painters would really appreciate and understand. He sort of thought of them as being like things that he made for other artists because they were so deliberate and carefully thought out and so meticulously painted. In a way, he saw them as being paintings, for artists, even though they were, very, very widely collected, particularly by British collectors. This is such a great picture, and I have to say that this is one of the many examples of Fantin-Latour's art that I think it's beautiful in a photograph, but you can't even anticipate how beautiful it is in person from the photograph. My co-curator, Dr. Mitchell Merling, wrote about this painting for the catalog, and he talked about the way it's almost this kind of study in repetition and monotony almost, that it's these round flowers, these China asters that are just these round blossoms, and the bouquet is round, and it's in a vase that's round, and the background is almost kind of unmodulated, and it's almost like how much of a composition can you pull out of this sort of monotony, and yet I think that certainly when you stand in front of this, there's nothing monotonous about it. You're completely absorbed into this kind of the spectacle, the sort of theater of the paint is so mesmerizing, and it has such a material quality, such a present quality that it, I think that's really in a way the amazing thing about fantin-latour is that there can be something so quiet and modest and unassuming about what he's doing, and as a painter, he's so ambitious and so technically accomplished and so such a virtuoso that it sort of supersedes any of that, the possible monotony that could have come in.
The scope of the exhibition spans over several centuries. Can you please speak to the changes that came into play from the beginning, from Chardin to the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists?
Yeah, I mean, we started in the middle of the 18th century and in the 1930s, so it's not quite 2 centuries, but a nice big span of French painting. We definitely wanted to showcase that dialogue back and forth, not just between contemporaries, but also across generations. And certainly Van Gogh is one of the artists practicing flower painting in France that is really important sort of pivot point. There are 5 examples of his flower painting in the exhibition, and this one is just a gorgeous one from 1886, the first year that he arrived in Paris and began painting. And he really began his practice, the French period of his career, with flower painting. That was what he delved into first. And in many ways, this is quite a traditional approach to flower painting. It's the vase sort of centered against a black background. There's a great deal of symmetry, a sort of sense of sort of solid presence that you can see Van Gogh's, of course, deep familiarity with the Dutch still life tradition here, but the painting is just, it's exuberant. It's a way of handling that, of course, like nobody had really seen paint handling like this, and this painting is remarkably well preserved. So you have this, the wonderful sense of color and movement of paint, even in the background, which is fantastic. And in addition to this great bouquet, which is just leaping off the canvas, I love the way that he's painted this table, which I think is meant to be a sort of a reflective marble table with a little bit of that sheen and a little bit of a color of its own. But you can see the way it's reflecting the color of this green vase, or reflecting the red notes of the flowers here and there. But then the more you look, the more it just becomes this incredible just smear of paint just pulled across the canvas. I mean, nobody was painting floral still lifes like this before Van Gogh. Even though he is, the format, the composition is quite traditional, his way of working with the paint and the way of kind of rendering optical sensation is utterly unlike anyone.
We want to thank Heather for speaking with us. You can find more information on the exhibition at dma.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.